Today, we are going to talk about what Jewish communities in America looked like, how they observed, how they didn't observe, emphasis on the didn't observe more than the observed, and how they adapted and created a sort of American version of Judaism during this period. And you're going to meet a lot of colorful folks and hear a lot of colorful stories today. So we're going to talk about Jewish life in the New World. So in order to understand Jewish life in the New World, we have to understand a number of things. We have to understand why people came to America. And we're going to have to talk a lot about that because America was a Jewish wasteland, as we're going to see. So the decision to come here is quite a significant decision. What was the Jewish identity like for these people who came? How did they organize their communities? How did they make a living? How were they received by non-Jews? And how were they received by the government? In order to understand all those questions, we have to have a basis for comparison. America is backwater, backwater, backwater at this point in time in terms of the Jewish world. So in order to get a baseline, we have to understand what Jewish life was like in the old world in the 18th century and early 19th century. So let's start there. The world Jewish population in 1800, as you see here on the slide, was about 2.5 million. Sizable population. It's going to grow exponentially in the 19th century, but at the beginning of the 19th century, it's about 2.5 million. Of that 2.5 million, you see we have 1 million in Poland, Russia, and Galicia. Poland's actually part of Russia. Most of Poland is part of Russia at this point. Galicia is in the northernmost tip of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. About another 1 million in North Africa and the Middle East, most of which is governed by the Ottoman Empire. And about 500,000 scattered throughout Central and Western Europe. As you can see, America does not even rate. So I'm just going to give you a little visual here. These are Jewish communities that are over, the big circles are over 7,000, the little circles are over 300. So you can see that there are lots and lots of small Jewish communities, but most of them are really, really centered in that Eastern European area, that area that had been Poland and is now Russia. America is not going to look like that. Now let's look at the population of America. America is literally irrelevant to world Jewry at this time. It's very difficult for us to understand that because we're used to being incredibly relevant to world Jewry, being up until very recently the largest community in the world. Israel just surpassed us in the past couple of years, but they're irrelevant. If you count the Jewish population as being 5,000, which is, as you can see, the upper end of what was here in 1820, American Jews are 0.2% of world Jewry. 0.2%. Not only that, but today we look at small Jewish communities in places like Poland or the Ukraine as being significant, even though they're tiny, because there is immense Jewish history there. There was no Jewish history here. So it's not like it's a tiny Jewish community, but there once was something. You know, the Ramah Shul is still in Krakow, we should go visit it, that kind of thing. No, there was nothing here. So America is the most backwater Jewish community in the world at this time. It's very hard, again, for us to imagine today. I tried to find a similar, as I was preparing, a similar Jewish community in terms of size. And what I came up with was Chile. Anyone know any Jews in Chile? I don't. But that's basically, that's the, compared to world Jewry today, the size of the Jewish community in Chile is essentially similar to what America was at that time.
When you showed the map, you didn't show any Jewish community in Asia at all.
Right. There are in India, China. Later on, like going to the 20th century, the Chinese Jewish community expands a lot, and the Japanese Jewish community also expands a lot. But at this point, there's in India, I would say India is probably the largest, and there's a small community in China. Yeah, but really the vast majority of the world lives between Moscow and London. Yeah.
And you didn't even show Minsk.
Right, so Minsk is in there in that like sea of purple dots. Minsk is in that sea of purple dots on that map. Yeah, I mean it's just a totally different world in Europe. So let's talk a little bit about what Jewish communities look like in Europe. This is probably not news to any of you. The vast majority of Jews living in the 18th century and early 19th century are still living profoundly, profoundly traditional lives, even in Central Europe and certainly in Eastern Europe, where they don't modernize until the 20th century. You have Hasidism, which is an innovative movement. It's hard for us to think of it as an innovative movement today, because today they're so profoundly, they're most traditional of all the Jews, but at that time it was a radical, innovative movement. So that is spreading throughout Eastern Europe very, very quickly, rapid fire at this time. And the Reform movement is about to be born in Germany. It's born in 1810, around. And the Enlightenment and the Haskalah have taken place, the Jewish Enlightenment have taken place in Germany. But really, for the most part, we're talking about those teeny little Jewish communities with 300 or fewer people, and these people are profoundly, profoundly traditional. They're living in small communities, very close-knit, and they're pretty much autonomous. Before the Jews are emancipated in Central Europe, and they don't get emancipated till the 20th century in Eastern Europe when the Russian Revolution happens, they basically govern themselves. There's total corporate structure of this Jewish community. They govern themselves, and they have their own criminal courts. They even have their own jails, and the general government, the secular government, supports them and backs them up. So they're governing themselves. They're living on their own. They're profoundly traditional. They're not very integrated at all, and they speak Yiddish. I mean, obviously, the North African Jews and the Middle Eastern Jews and the Indian Jews are not speaking Yiddish, but the Jews that we're talking about, the 1.5 million that are living in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, they speak Yiddish. That is their mother tongue. They know a little bit of German or a little bit of Russian or a little bit of Polish to get around and to integrate economically, but they speak Yiddish. That's the language that they speak. That's the language they're educated in. That's their mother tongue. Okay, so this is actually a picture of one of the wooden shuls of Poland, where they actually wrote the tefillot on the walls. I don't know if you've been to Poland. Some of them still exist today in Central Europe and in Poland. Most of them were destroyed, but there are a few left. They were very, very beautiful.
Volozhin is now a leather factory.
A factory? Oh, yeah, terrible. Yeah, I actually visited one of the shuls like that. It was in a place called Trebich, which is a shtetl. It's protected by UNESCO. It's in southern Czech Republic, almost at the border of Austria. And it's the most incredibly beautiful shul, and there are absolutely no Jews in the town at all. But you walk around the town, and there are like doorways with the mezuzah carving, like that hole for the mezuzah carved out. And it's like this little trendy sort of place now, like a little resort area, and they built a little hotel that has a dining room in it, a small dining room, like the size of this conference room. And as they were excavating to build the dining room, they found a mikveh underneath the dining room floor. And it's the most unbelievable thing. There are no Jews, not a single one in this place, but they sort of it's a Jewish heritage site now, and they put a glass floor, a very thick glass floor over the mikveh so that you can look down into it. But yeah, it's extraordinary, yeah.
When did Yiddish really take the start?
It's a good question. Earlier. We have the first evidence of Yiddish being used as early as 900. Yeah, there is a poem, Central Europe, in Germany. There weren't really Jews living in Eastern Europe yet in 900. They really start moving to Eastern Europe in the 1300s and not extensively into the 1400s. And that happens because the Jews are expelled from Central Europe and they need a place to go, and Poland welcomes them in. So Yiddish is really non-existent in Eastern Europe at that time. It's really existent in that Germanic, the Franco-Germanic area, like where Rashi grew up, Mainz and Worms, that area. And there's a poem that dates back to the 900s. Yeah. I mean, it's not Yiddish that today's Yiddish speakers can really understand in the way that Shakespearean English is hard for English speakers today to understand, but it's Yiddish. Yeah, the history of Yiddish is absolutely fascinating. I wish I knew more about it. I know a limited amount about it, but it's an amazing thing. My parents are both, their first language was Yiddish, both my parents. And they didn't speak Yiddish to us because that was their secret language. I don't know if any of you had that experience. So
I did.
Yeah, so now, like I'm getting my PhD in Jewish history, I had to pass an exam in Yiddish. And I'm so mad at my mother. I'm like, why didn't you speak Yiddish to me? And she said, I don't know, I should have. And so.
Well, my parents, if they didn't want us to understand, they would speak Yiddish. They both came from Yiddish-speaking homes. But of course English, and they wanted us to know Hebrew. So
Right.
that's what was stressed.
Right, exactly. Hebrew was stressed, and also there was this firm desire not to be immigrant, like not to be like an immigrant kind of person. And my mother tells this story, which is such a poignant story, that when she was pregnant with my brother, I'm the oldest, and when she was pregnant with my brother, she and my father went to California on vacation, and they left me with my immigrant grandparents to stay for a week. And she was so scared, I was 2, she was so scared that she was going to come back and I was going to be speaking English with an accent. And imagine, like, worrying about that. Like, it's insane. After a week I was but there was it was the 1960s, and there was such this burning desire to be American, 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 that she was worried about that. And now she looks back at it and she says, you know, what was I thinking? I should have spoken Yiddish to you, and then it would have been great. So, yeah. Okay. So, now that we have some at least limited sense of what the baseline is, what are we thinking about in terms of the old world? This is my favorite way to teach about the new world. This is a letter to the Alte Heim, the old home, from an American Jewish woman, written in 1791. It was written in Yiddish. It's in English here. It is, I think, one of the best tools for understanding the American Jewish community, because she writes this letter, and, you know, usually you have to, like, you know, it's one person's experience, it doesn't really extrapolate. Well, this letter extrapolates beautifully. So I'm going to read it to you, and as I'm reading, I want you to think about what we can learn from this letter about Jews' religious life, about their interactions with the Gentiles, about their economic life, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. Dear parents, I hope my letter will ease your mind. You can now be reassured and send me one of the family to Charleston, South Carolina. This is the place to which, with God's help, we will go after Passover. The whole reason why we are leaving this place is because of its lack of Yehudishkeit, Jewishness. Dear parents, I know quite well you will not want me to bring up my children like Gentiles. Here, they cannot become anything else. Jewishness is pushed aside here. There are here in Petersburg, Virginia, 10 or 12 Jews, and they are not worthy of being called Jews. We have a shochet here who goes to market and buys treif meat and brings it home. On Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur, the people worshipped here without one Sefer Torah, and not one of them wore the talit or the arba kanfot, except Hyman and my Sammy's godfather. The latter is an old man of 60, a man from Holland. He's been in America for 30 years already. For 20 years he was in Charleston, and he's been living here for 4 years. He doesn't want to remain here any longer and will go with us to Charleston. In that place, there's a blessed community of 300 Jews. You can believe me that I crave to see a synagogue to which I can go. The way we live now is no life at all. We do not know what the Sabbath and holidays are. On the Sabbath, all the Jewish shops are open, and they do business on that day as they do throughout the whole week. But ours we do not allow to open. With us, there's still some Sabbath. You must believe me that in our house we all live as Jews as much as we can. As for the Gentiles, we have nothing to complain about. For the sake of a livelihood, we do not have to leave here, nor do we have to leave because of debts. I believe ever since Hyman has grown up, he has not had it this good. You cannot know what a wonderful country this is for the common man. One can live here peacefully. Hyman made a clock that goes very accurately, just like the one in the Buchenstrasse in Hamburg. Now you can imagine what honors Hyman has been getting here. In all of Virginia, there is no clock like this one. And Virginia is the greatest province in the whole of America. And America is the largest section of the world. Now you know what sort of country this is. It's not too long since Virginia was discovered. It's a young country, and it's amazing to see the business they do in little Petersburg. At times, as many as 1,000 hogsheads of tobacco arrive at one time, and each hogshead contains 1,000 and sometimes 1,200 pounds of tobacco. The tobacco is shipped from here to the whole world. When Judah, my brother, comes here, he can become a watchmaker and a goldsmith if he so desires. Here is not like Germany, where a watchmaker is not permitted to sell silverware. They don't know otherwise here. They expect a watchmaker to be a silversmith here. Hyman has more to do in making silverware than with watchmaking. He has a journeyman, a silversmith, a very good artisan, and he, Hyman, takes care of the watches. This work is well paid here, but in Charleston, it pays even better. All the people who hear we are leaving give us their blessings. They say that it is sinful that such blessed children should be brought up here in Petersburg. My children cannot learn anything here, nothing Jewish, nothing of general culture. My Shana, my daughter, God bless her, is already 3 years old. I think it's time she should learn something, and she has a good head to learn. I've taught her the bedtime prayers and grace after meals in just 2 lessons. I believe that no one among the Jews here can do as well as she. And my Sammy, God bless him, is already beginning to talk. I could write more. However, I do not have any more paper. I love that line. I remain your devoted daughter and servant, Rebecca, the wife of Chaim, the son of Shmuel the Levite. Okay, Jewish life in America. What is it? Disaster, right? Total disaster. They're buying treif meat and selling it. Their stores are open on Shabbos. No one's wearing tzitzis. They have no Sefer Torah. They don't have a minyan. It's a nightmare, right? Economically, aces. It's great. Couldn't be better. Now in Europe, what she's talking about when she says that watch and silversmith thing, in Europe there were guilds at this time. And if you were in the silversmith guild, then you couldn't sell watches because you had to be in the watchmakers guild to sell watches, and you couldn't be in two, and Jews usually couldn't be in any. So here's not only can he have access to the guilds, but doesn't even have to be in a guild. He can just do whatever he wants. It's like free American entrepreneurial. It's awesome, right? The Gentiles, love them, no problem. Nobody's discriminating against them. Nobody hates them. It's all good. The Jewish life is a wreck. I think there's something very interesting about their feelings toward America. I read in this letter a sense of pride, right? She's very proud of America. Virginia's big, and they have 1,200 hogsheads of tobacco, and Virginia's the best province in America, and America's the biggest place in the world. And so despite the train wreck of their Jewish life, she's proud of being an American. Like she's happy. She's proud. Nonetheless, she can't stay in this Petersburg. She's going to go to Charleston. Why? Charleston's so great. Charleston has 300 Jews. And as you're going to hear in a little bit, when you hear about what the Jewish life was like in Charleston, you're going to say, really? Like that was such an upgrade? But it was an upgrade from this. So you see that it's a whole lot can be gleaned from this letter. Really, really significant amounts of stuff. And really, her picture is quite accurate. Jewish religious life in America is very, very weak. It's very weak. I'm going to talk about why in a minute. Jewish economic life in America is very strong. Jews can do very well with ease. Their relationship with Gentiles is quite good. This country has a lot of enlightened thinkers in it. It was founded mostly by Protestants who are already predisposed toward inclusion of those who are different, except for the Puritans, but okay, forgetting the Puritans, the rest of them. And we see that the Jews very early on take on this sense of pride about being American. Okay, so who were these people who came? Because you gotta wonder, right? Why is Rebecca Samuels in America? Why would she come? The type of people who came were the kinds of people who don't mind living without a Jewish infrastructure, right? These are people who are going to work it out if they're in a place where there's no Sefer Torah. They'll be okay if there's no mikvah. They're not going to be so worried if there's no kosher butcher. So it's not like today where, the vast majority of Jews in America don't care about any of those things. Back then, we know in Europe, no one would live in a place without a shochet or a mikvah. They would, a Sefer Torah, oh my God, they would never do such a thing. So obviously these people have Judaism as not number one on the priority list. It might be number two, but it's definitely not number one, because if it was number one, they would not have come. In the same way as none of us would agree to live in Montana because there's no Jewish life there, and where are we going to send our children to school, where are our grandchildren going to go to school? We'd never do that. Similarly, these people have chosen to do that. So clearly that says something about them. Why are they here? Well, they're interested in making money. This is a place where you don't have to be in the guild. This is a place where you can sell hogsheads of tobacco and make a ton of money. There is so much opportunity here. It's such a fresh, wide open land with no restrictions and no baggage from the old world, and so that's why they come. So these people are adventurous, and they are risk takers. That's not going to bode well for the poor rabbis when they finally come to this country, because these people are not rule followers. They're young. And they're young. That is true. They are absolutely young, for sure. Because, to survive that ocean crossing, you have to be young at that time. These are people who are not into rabbinic authority. Many of them are a few generations removed, but were from converso families that we learned about last week, who had been either forcibly converted or almost forcibly converted to Christianity in Spain and in Portugal. So they lost their connection with rabbinic authority at that time, and many of them never really regained it. So these are not people who love rabbinic authority, or feel bound by rabbinic authority. So are they religious? Sort of. Rebecca Samuels was religious. There are people who are religious. There are a lot of people who aren't, or who at least have a difficult relationship with being religious. Are they traditional? Yeah, they keep traditions on their terms. Those people in Petersburg, they still daven on Rosh Hashanah. They may not be wearing tzitzis, they may not have a Sefer Torah, but they still thought it was a holiday and wanted to do something about it. These people do care. They care about being Jewish, but as I said before, not number one on the priority list. So, what kind of Jewish community are Jews like this going to create? I love this. This is a really interesting document. This is a letter, an entry in a journal written by a Swedish non-Jew in 1748. His name was Peter Kalm. He was an explorer and a botanist and a naturalist, and he wrote this description. He happened to have had a lot of friends that were Jews, and he visited Shereth, Israel, and he wrote this description. Besides the different sects of Christians, there are many Jews settled in New York who possess great privileges. They have synagogues and houses and great country seats of their own property and are allowed to keep shops in town. They have likewise several ships, which they freight and send out with their own goods. So these are wealthy people. In fine, they enjoy all the privileges common to the other inhabitants of this town and province. During my residence at New York, I was frequently in company with Jews. I was informed, among other things, that these people never boiled any meat for themselves on Saturday, but that they always did it the day before, and that in the winter, they kept a fire during the whole Saturday. Okay, so far so good, right? We're good. We're observing Shabbos. They commonly eat no pork. We're still good. Yet, here's where the problem is going to arise. I have been told by several men of credit that many of them, especially among the young Jews, when traveling, did not make the least difficulty about eating this or any other meat that was put before them, even though they were in the company with Christians. I was in their synagogue last evening for the first time. I was put into a particular seat, which was set apart for strangers or Christians. Both men and women were dressed entirely in the English fashion. The former had all of them their hats on and did not once take them off during service. The galleries, I observed, were appropriated to the ladies, while the men sat below. During prayers, the men spread a white cloth over their heads, tallis. I observed that the wealthier sort of people had a much richer sort of cloth than the poorer ones. Many of the men had Hebrew books in which they sang and read alternately. The rabbi stood in the middle of the synagogue and read with his face turned toward the east. So it's actually, again, a document that really tells us a lot and is actually pretty accurate across the board. These are people who are observing traditionally when they're in shul. This is not Petersburg. It's a big city, so they're more traditional and there are more people. But they still have this problem of observance, right? When you scratch the surface and they leave the shul building, they're eating pork or they're doing whatever they're doing. They're not necessarily being so observant. So what is this about? Let's draw some conclusions about religion in the New World. First of all, religion in the New World was a layperson's religion. As I spoke about last week, there are no rabbis here until 1840. And when poor Abraham Rice, the first rabbi, comes, he has a very tough time reigning in his congregation and ends up leaving them because they refuse to observe anything. So who's in charge? Religious functionaries is the word that historians use for it. What's that? Shamashim, exactly, shamashim. There are wealthy lay leaders who are sort of running things, and they're employing the shamash, the shlich tzibur, the mohel, the melamed, the shochet. Those are the kinds of people who are employed by the Jewish community, by the synagogue, and each Jewish community has one synagogue at this point, if that. But there's no rabbi. So those people are sort of bossed around by the wealthy parnasim of the shul, and they make the rules, and these people follow the rules. Certainly, even a shaliach tzibur does not have the ability to sort of give psak on issues of Jewish law. They lead davening. They have a nice voice, but they're not like issuing psak. This picture here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him later, you may have heard of him, is Gershom Mendes Seixas, who was the Chazan of Shereth Israel for a long time. And look at him. I mean, he's just such a fancy, like,
Lovely.
like he's gorgeous, right? He's very good-looking man.
You had
He's-
Chaim Solomon on before.
Yes.
We haven't yet talked about
We're going to talk about him next week because he has a lot to do with interaction with the state and financing the Revolutionary War, and I'll sort of debunk some myths about him next week.
Jewry,
But
that's a Spanish-Portuguese
Yeah.
synagogue. I was married there.
really, it's a beautiful building. I was just there a few weeks ago. Yeah, so I mean, he's like gorgeous guy, and he's got his little mutton chops, and he's dressed very beautifully. We're going to see a picture of him later, another picture which I will explore with you a little bit in a minute. But he's not wearing a kippah or anything on his head. So there's also a real lack of structure, like the way we have sort of national networks of synagogues today. I mean, there were only 6 synagogues, maybe 7 in this period, so it's not like they need a national network of synagogues, but they don't have one. And even the Christians aren't so organized in America at this time. It takes a while for the Catholic diocese to get started, and it's well into the 19th century before they've gotten themselves organized, and the Protestant churches also are not well organized. It's a country of adventurous risk takers. It's a country of independent-minded people who don't like to submit to authority. Well, this is why they came, right? That's why they're here. They didn't want to submit to the British Crown. They didn't want to submit to rabbinic authority. They didn't want to submit to any authority. So that's why they're here. It's also very important to understand that it's a voluntary community, the Jewish community here. And that is in distinct contrast to the European Jewish community, in which you had no choice. You had to be a part of it. The government, the secular government, and the Jewish community mandated that you were members of the Jewish community. The only way to get out of that was by converting. In America, nobody cares if you're a member of the Jewish community. They couldn't care less. The government, they don't even know you're Jewish. They're not asking, and you're not telling, and nobody cares. So here, I mean, we still have a voluntary Jewish community today, obviously. But when you have a voluntary Jewish community, you have to make it palatable for people to remain part of it, especially these adventurous, risk-taking type people who aren't necessarily going to submit. So that's another thing that's really important to understand about religion in the New World. So what is that? What combine the type of people who came to this kind of structure of religion, and what do you end up with? Okay, well, you end up with a profound lack of knowledge about Jewish ritual and law, right? Because there's no rabbis to tell you what to do, and the minute the children are born, it's not like there's like an SAR for them to go to. There are no Jewish schools. We're going to talk about education a little later, and you're going to see how bad that was. It's really, really hard to keep Jews affiliated and observant in this country. Really, really hard. They don't have religious leaders to inspire them. They are not the kind of people who are going to stay religious. Religion was never number 1 on their priority list. They don't have the education to back it up. They can't raise the next generation that way. They don't have the infrastructure here to support it. So it's going to be a real problem.
Were the reasons they left the old country economic?
Yes.
They thought that perhaps here they could make a living.
Yes. I mean, I'm sure that underneath the surface, while it was primarily economic, underneath the surface, the people who left were probably chafing a little bit about being in such close-knit Jewish communities, and they probably wanted out to some extent. I mean, this is right around the dawn of some modern thinking, particularly in the Central European Jewish communities. So certainly as the 19th century wears on, you see many more of these people sort of escaping the confining nature of the Jewish communities in Europe. But I think even these people were a little bit like that. Just make sure I'm on time. Okay. So just so you have a sense, before we talk a little bit about the specific rules that the communities enacted to try to control their members, here is a list of the 6 synagogues, the 6 first synagogues in America. So obviously, Shereth Israel, 1654. We learned about the Recife 23, who founded that shul last week. And then we have Yeshua Israel, which became the Touro Synagogue in the 18th century, mid-18th century, but founded in 1658. And then we have 2 mikveh Israels. We have one in Savannah and one in Philadelphia. Then we have Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim in Charleston, and we have Kahal Kadosh Beth Shalom in Richmond. And this was it. Those were the synagogues. So why in those places? They're port cities. That's really what was going on. The main port city you see, there are two port cities that are sort of on the eastern seaboard that you don't see here. The first one was Boston. The reason there was no synagogue in Boston until later on in the 18th century was because it was Puritan run, and the Puritans didn't let the Jews stay there for a long time. And even after the country was founded and Jews could obviously then settle, it was no longer a Puritan colony. They didn't. It took them a little while to sort of get into there. So Boston comes a little bit later, and Baltimore is the other big port city, and the Baltimore Jewish community gets founded early in the 19th century. Yeah.
Excuse me, I visited Charleston.
Oh, you did? I'm dying to go there.
In May.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting. The people involved in slavery used to send the boats out from Rhode Island, and that's why Rhode Island became a place where a synagogue, I guess, would arise. But they would bring, once they sent them out from Rhode Island, the boats, they came into Charleston with the slaves.
Wow.
And
you're talking about Jews? Or anybody?
Well, there were Jews
Yeah,
involved.
for sure.
And so those were two places, Rhode Island and Charleston, which I see had big shuls there.
Yes.
Probably the merchants there involved in the slave trade.
Absolutely. The Jews were definitely involved in the slave trade, as horrifying as that may sound to us today. It was certainly the case. This is a picture of the Touro Synagogue. But this is not their original building, but this is the building from 1759. And I don't know if this is still the building today. I've never been there, shockingly. So I don't know if any of you have been there.
Yes.
Is this what it still looks like today? I don't know if this is an older building or if this is still the building.
I visited a synagogue. It wasn't the original one, but it was one of the early. It's now a conservative synagogue.
Right.
But it was one of the earlier ones. But there were two Orthodox ones in Savannah now. Charleston.
In Charleston.
Yes, two smaller.
Right. Well, Beth Elohim becomes the first Reform congregation in America, actually. Yes. Yeah. But it starts out Orthodox. Okay. So it was really hard to keep these shuls in shape, to keep the people observant, to keep the people coming. It was very, very difficult. So how did they do it? So I'm going to give you some great little stories. At first, they try to govern people's private lives. First of all, some of the shuls employ a shochet. The shul pays for the shochet. And they bring them over from Europe because, of course, there's nobody to train a shochet here. So they bring somebody over from Europe, and New York and Philadelphia both had a resident shochet that was paid by the shul. But they also tried to do other things. There was a case of a man in Philadelphia who shaved his beard while he was away in Baltimore on vacation.
Oh, boy.
And the shul decided to sanction him for that, for shaving his beard. Also, another story from Philadelphia. There's a man who is a Kohen who wants to marry a convert. And, of course, that is not against Jewish law. So the shul has a long, long debate about what they're going to do. Are they going to let this man marry the woman? And the decision is absolutely not. He cannot marry her. And no member of the shul can go to his wedding. And not only that, their names can't be mentioned in the shul from this point forward. All the shuls had bylaws that said things like you can't receive an aliyah or any kind of a synagogue honor if you are not observant of kashrut, not observant of Shabbat, not observant of Chagim. One of the shuls, Charleston, fined members when they found out that they were not observing Shabbat or Chagim. They were permitted to punish them in ways that they found appropriate. You can see here I put a picture of the Jewish cemetery in Charleston. Even the threat of not being buried there was not enough to keep these early American Jews observant. But that was one of the tactics that they tried is, if you don't keep Shabbos, we're not going to let you be buried in the synagogue. Obviously, intermarriage is a huge, huge, huge concern for the shuls, and they all have rules against intermarriage. Anyone who's intermarried cannot be a member, can't have synagogue honors, can't do this, can't do that, can't be buried in the cemetery.
Did they have conversions?
They did. They really did. They had a lot of conversions. A lot. Mostly women. And that goes on. We're going to talk about the conversions a lot in our last class, the one that's in January, and some intermarriages that were not without conversions, and the heartbreak that occurred in certain families because of that. As time went on, though, the shuls were unable to keep up these rules. In 1791, Sheriff Israel had this clause in their constitution that said, if you don't observe Shabbat or Kashrut or Chagim, you can't have a synagogue honor. They removed it in their 1805 constitution. They took it out. I guess it was hopeless, like that no one was listening. So it was like, as a friend of mine would say, it was a bracha levatala. It was irrelevant to have it there. In Philadelphia, similarly, the 1798 Constitution had all these rules. Sabbath violators were excluded from privileges and honors in the synagogue. They took their names out of the record book. They weren't allowed to be buried in the cemetery. The entire section was crossed out the next time they had a vote on the Constitution in the early 19th century, sorry. Here's the best one. Remember that Kohen and convert I told you about? That, they weren't going to announce their names and no one was allowed to go to the wedding? Not only did they give up on that and let him join the shul, he became the president. And that's my favorite one. It's like, talk about giving up, throwing your hands up in defeat. Like, that's it. In 1809, Sheriff Israel's Melamed, they had a teacher who they brought over from Europe, was accused of eating non-kosher food in the home of another shul member. So this is the Melamed. This is the guy who's teaching the kids, in 1809. So they don't actually even bother with chastising the shul member whose home he ate in. They only chastise him. I guess, they had their limits, like the guy teaching the children should be keeping kosher. So they did chastise him, but they didn't even bother with the family that was feeding him. So it's not good.
So they had a lot of control over people's personal lives.
Except that they didn't. They wanted desperately to have control of people's private lives, because in Europe they totally did. I mean, one thing I didn't mention, which is really important to understand, is there's a power the Jewish community has in Europe that the American Jewish community never had. They had the power to excommunicate people. The Jewish community in Europe could put you in a chayrim, and that was it. And no one would talk to you. And here, that was like the most ridiculous idea, that someone would put you in a chayrim. Please, like, no one's going to listen to that. Yeah.
It amazes me that there wasn't more assimilation during those times.
Right, I know. It's a very good point.
Surprising.
It's a good point. The fact that they stayed Jewish at all is a little bit of a miracle, right?
Absolutely.
It really is. It really is. Because if you think about, like, the selection of people who came and the circumstances that existed here, and a very, very welcoming and beckoning external society that was nice to them, not like Europe, it's amazing they stayed Jewish. It really is quite extraordinary. This part, I've actually, as someone who has devoted my life to Jewish education, I found particularly painful. There was horrendous Jewish education here, absolutely horrendous. The example I'm going to share with you is the example of Sheriff Israel. They had a benefactor that endowed a school attached to the synagogue in 1801. So first of all, 1801, I mean, they'd been there for 150 years already. It took them 150 years to establish a school. Like, come on, it's ridiculous, right? So by 1804, the school closed. They had no money left. The benefactor gave up. Nobody was paying tuition. Finished. So the leaders convene a meeting in the shul, and they're going to address the problem. And here's the statement that they issue. Oh, I love the capitalization and the spelling is, always funny in old American things. In order to make your children truly virtuous, you must rear them in the strict principles of our holy religion. And this cannot be efficiently done without they understand what they are saying when addressing the deity. Education, generally speaking, is the first thing which ought to be pursued in life in order to constitute us rational. How much then is to be expected from having, in addition thereto, a complete and full knowledge of the Hebrew language, being that in which all our prayers are read? Yet, notwithstanding this, it is with regret that it is perceived few, very few indeed, are concerned with it. Here's the story of this pathetic school. It did reopen after they lectured their congregation, disbanded the following year in 1805, opened again in 1808, stayed open for 3 years, closed. in 1811, opened again in 1812, closed in 1816, opened in 1818, and closed in 1821.
Was that an all-day school?
It was an all-day school. Yes, it was an all-day school. There were no public schools yet at this time, so people either paid tutors or they went to some kind of other school. But there was no concept of public schools yet this early. It was later on in the 19th century. In 1821, why did it close? They had 6 students enrolled in the school. Now this is, by 1821, there are probably 1,000 Jews living in New York. 6 students were enrolled in the school. Really? Where were they going to school? They had private tutors probably, or who knows where they were going. Horace Mann. 4 of those 6 students were admitted against over the objections of the synagogue leadership, which probably means they were children of intermarried couples. Where the Jewish spouse was like, oh, I've got to give him something, right? So this is it was a disaster. It was a complete disaster. Now, New York was the best of all the options because when you went to a place like Charleston, the synagogue didn't even have a line item in the budget for education of the children. It didn't exist. So you have to wonder, what were these people thinking? Why didn't they have school? I mean, that's one of the first things that we do today. We've even done it with the Lauder Foundation, did it in Eastern Europe, right? There are all these Jewish schools now in Prague and in Warsaw and in Krakow, they made these Lauder schools that are there. I don't know if you've visited them ever, but I visited them and I've worked with teachers from them in various Jewish history conferences and organizations that I'm involved with. And they have Jewish schools. Half the students aren't really Jewish or aren't Jewish at all and don't even pretend to be Jewish, but they do have Jewish schools there. But somehow there wasn't that commitment here. And that was a huge failing, because think about the impact of that. If you already have people who are not observing Kashrut, not observing Shabbat, not observing Chagim, not observing halachas like Kohen and converts and all this kind of stuff, and then you don't teach their children, what are you going to get in the next generation? It's going to be a disaster. So, big problem. Yeah?
What was Jewish education in Europe?
Good question. I should have said that.
Really, they didn't.
I should have said that.
Maybe a cheder?
Yes. So here's what happened. Here's what Jewish education looked like in Europe at this time. Jewish boys had virtually universal literacy in Hebrew. They went to school, not through high school. Typically, they went through 6th grade, 7th grade. But nobody went to high school back then. It was very unusual. The boys who were particularly gifted went on to a yeshiva gavoa in a city. But most of the time they were going to a local cheder or yeshiva katana until 6th or 7th grade. The girls typically were not well educated. If they did learn to read and write, they did it at home. Their parents taught them, or the wealthy girls would have a tutor. But there was not universal literacy at all among Jewish girls. It was higher than the non-Jewish world, probably around 50%. Which was significantly higher than what non-Jewish girls were experiencing in the late 18th century. And literacy expands rapidly among Jewish girls in the 19th century, particularly in Germany, where the Neo-Orthodox community and the Reform community open up Jewish schools that are co-ed or that are girls' schools that give a significant Jewish education. But kids in Europe, they weren't educated secularly. They didn't really have a good education secularly, particularly the Jews in Eastern Europe, but they did have a good Jewish education. I mean, it wasn't a good Jewish education compared to what you can get today because they left so young. But no one was going to school past that time. They would have been in school for many hours a day, learning Tanakh, learning Gemara when they got to be maybe 4th, 5th grade. Certainly they could all read a Siddur, could all read Tanakh, could all read Rashi and translate it into Yiddish. Jewish women learned from a book called Seno Rena, which was a Yiddish language sort of Tanakh compendium with stories and explanations and things like that. So the women who could read from that and learned from that. They were reasonably well educated. I mean, for the time, they were reasonably well educated. During the course of the 19th century, they start getting a secular education, which did not exist early on in this period. I mean, the period we're talking about, they weren't getting a secular education, whereas these guys probably were getting a secular education. But they had a good Jewish education. Good enough. Okay. So these people are going to end up creating a kind of an American Judaism. which of course we still have today. It's morphed and changed enormously based on the migrations that we've had since that time. But there are certain very significantly American elements of their observance and their behavior. The first thing is, once America becomes a country, the synagogues sort of like take on the attitude of democracy, which is, it's so adorable. It's adorable is kind of a pejorative phrase, but it's amazing what they do. They adopt constitutions. All the synagogues adopt constitutions when the United States adopts a constitution. They have voting. All the men vote. The women don't vote, but the men vote. But women didn't vote in America either, so they were mirroring what was going on around them. They had bylaws. They would have discussions, and then the vote would come after that, and you had to be a paid-up member, and then you would vote. And it was a very, very official thing. I actually copied down the beginning of the Shereth Israel Constitution from 1790, which is right after the United States adopts their Constitution in 1789. It says, "In a state happily constituted upon the principles of equal liberty, civil and religious, the several societies, as members of that government, partaking of that blessing, being free to adopt the best means for preserving their privileges, and for entering into such compact for regulating and well ordering the internal institutions for the administration of the affairs of their several communities, declare the following rules shall serve for and be considered as a constitution." So they're talking these very elevated terms about liberty and civil and religious freedoms, and they're really adopting what they see around them in a very profound way. You can see there's a picture there of the Constitution, the cover of the Constitution of Mikveh Israel, and they were very, very proud of that. They built synagogues that looked like churches. You can see here that's Beth Elohim in Charleston. Did you see Beth Elohim when you were there? That's actually one of the oldest synagogue buildings in the country. It might even be the oldest synagogue building in the country. I don't remember. That's still standing. It's old. It's one of the older ones. And the first synagogue in Baltimore was built in 1820 something or 1830 something. Also looks like this. It looks like either a Masonic temple or like an early Georgian church or a government building, doesn't it? It's extraordinary. It looks like Washington, D.C., right? Imposing, but not Jewish at all, right? And all the early synagogues looked like that. They built synagogues that looked like churches. The one in Charleston actually, not in Charleston, the one in Savannah had a steeple, which was really unusual. And actually, there's a synagogue. I work at Camp Moshava in the summer in Honesdale. And there's a little very, very, very old Jewish community in Honesdale. It's Reform. It became Reform probably in the 1850s or something like that, but it was founded in the 1820s or 30s. And they have the smallest standing synagogue building that was built to be a synagogue in the country. The whole building is like the size of this room. And it also has a steeple.
What's the purpose of the steeple?
To look like a church.
And what is the purpose of the steeple in the church?
I think for the church bell, I think that, but they didn't have a bell. Yeah. They just wanted to look like a church. That's all. They just wanted to look like a church.
You needed the elevator man to ring the ring.
Yeah, exactly. So this one, the Beth Elohim doesn't have a steeple, but it certainly does look very, secular. When I take people to see the Baltimore synagogues, there are two very old synagogues in Baltimore, one from the early 19th century and one from the 1860s. And they're on both sides of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, which is right in the middle. And the Jewish Museum sort of owns both of the buildings, and you can go into them and tour them.
Shari Zion?
No, Shari Zion was probably downtown at some point, but now it's in Pikesville. It's in the suburbs, and on Park Heights Avenue.
My uncle was the rabbi then.
Really?
Rabbi Tabak.
Oh, he's not the rabbi anymore.
No, this was in the 30s.
Yeah. The rabbi who's there now is a very lovely man, actually. But I haven't heard of Rabbi Tabak. So the synagogue that was built in the 1820s or 30s looks exactly like this, and there's nothing Jewish on the external anywhere on the building. There's no Ten Commandments, there's no Jewish star, there's no Hebrew letters, nothing. And then you go to that synagogue that's built in the 1860s, and it's like, there's stained glass windows with all kinds of Jewish stuff on it, and the Hebrew letters of the shul, but they didn't do that then. They really sort of adopted what the churches looked like. They also adopted some Christian norms, which are really interesting. They had more English prayer in the synagogues, and this is way, way, way before that happened in Europe. In Europe, they start having prayers in German in the 19th century, but not till in 1810 and forward, they start praying more in German. But this is, already in the late 18th century, they start praying in English in America. They also do things like, they have, when a shul dedicates a new building, we always have this thing where we have a procession with the Torahs, right? You take the Torahs from the old Aron Kodesh and you dance them through the streets and you put them in the new Aron Kodesh. So we actually have records of 3 of those ceremonies taking place when buildings were built in this period. So we have one from Shereth Israel, one from Savannah, and one from Charleston. No, I'm not Shereth Israel. Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia in 1782, and then one from Savannah in 1820, and one from Charleston in 1820. So the one in Philadelphia, they actually had this traditional procession, and they danced the Torahs in, and they put them in the Aron Kodesh, and it was basically, a Jewish thing. In Savannah, they had an organ playing in 1820. That's early. I mean, they were starting to do that in Germany. Reformers were starting to do that in Germany by 1820. But in America, they weren't doing it ideologically. It wasn't an ideological statement. They were doing it because that's what Christians did, and they just copied them. So, and not only that, they had the Masonic order was very popular back then, and they had the Masonic sign and all these Masonic traditions involved in the ceremony, including Masonic English prayer, and even non-Jewish Masonic people were participating in it. It was really nuts. So Savannah and Charleston both had this major component of the Masonic temple involved with their Torah dedication, their synagogue dedication, which is bizarre. Also, the office of the Chazan changed very, very dramatically during this period. So before, it was these the Parnas, the wealthy members of the Jewish community, represented the Jewish community to the rest of America. That's the way it had been done in Europe, and that's the way it was done here. But over time, as America became a country, and as the Jews were copying the Christians that were around them, the Chazan started to represent the congregation the way Protestant ministers represented their congregations. Now, the Chazan is not a religious leader. He leads davening, but there was nothing else, so he became the guy. He really, was appointed because he had a good voice and he knew how to daven, but that was basically it. He's not like he had rabbinic authority. He didn't know Jewish law necessarily particularly well. This new role, this very sweet story, was very apparent in 1788. There was a parade when Pennsylvania adopted the Constitution and became a state. They had a parade on the 4th of July to celebrate in Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia Chazan of Mikveh Israel marched arm in arm with 2 clergymen. And, he was the guy. Try to imagine that today. It's the Chazan doesn't have that role. It's just not, it doesn't make sense. But that was what there was, so that's what they did.
They didn't have a rabbi at the head of the community.
Exactly. They didn't have a rabbi, so they just did that. At the same time, they do maintain certain elements of Jewish distinctiveness. They maintain separate seating, which is a big deal. It's a big deal in this country because this country doesn't do separate seating. The Reform movement in Europe, until the Holocaust, they had separate seating, which is, people are always shocked when they hear that. They did not have mixed seating, and they would have been horrified to have mixed seating. You don't sit mixed in a place of prayer, but that's because the Lutherans didn't sit mixed in their house of prayer. But in America, because they were so low church, the churches were so lay-led and so commoner-led, and there was no elevated ritual Catholic stuff going on, or very little. Mixed seating became a thing very early on in America, and by the 1860s, all the synagogues that turned Reform went mixed seating. But at this time, they maintained their separate seating, which was unusual and significant. They also maintain a lot of Hebrew liturgy. They're still wearing talitot, as you saw in that excerpt where the non-Jew is witnessing what's going on. They're facing east. They're davening a traditional liturgy. He also spoke about the Sidurim that they had. So they do maintain some Jewish distinctiveness, even while they're adopting a lot of Christian stuff that's going on around. I had to show you this picture of Gershon Mendesacius, who called himself Reverend, to fit in with the Protestant ministers around. Look at his collar. I mean, that's a minister's collar. He's totally took on,
Looks like a Puritan.
He does look like a Puritan, right? He looks exactly like a Puritan. He was appointed in 1768. He was 23 years old when he was appointed, and he served for a very long time, till 1814. as the Chazan. He was one of 6 children of a Portuguese converso family. They had to flee London because the father was accused of continuing to practice Judaism. So his father left London for New York. He married an Ashkenazi woman in New York, which was something also that never happened in Europe. Sephardim didn't marry Ashkenazim ever. But in America, everything was okay, so they got married. And so their son was American born. He was American born, and he became the Chazan of Sheretz Israel. Now, you can imagine what this guy's Jewish education was like, right? His father is a child of conversos, right? So already you're like, he doesn't know anything. And there's no Jewish schools in America. So whatever he learned, he's learning from his converso descended father, which is, who knows what he knew. He did not have a great secular education, but he had a reasonable one. He actually became, I put there a picture of King's College, which became Columbia. He was a trustee beginning in 1784 of Columbia. For the rest of his life, he was trustee of Columbia University. During the American Revolution, we'll talk more about this next week, about how Jews behaved in the American Revolution, but Seixas actually was a huge backer of the revolution. Yeah.
How did he get the title of reverend?
He took it. He just took it. He was like, yeah, that's my title. And he was really quite a man about town. He put himself out there as reverend. He used a lot of Christian language in his sermons. He used the phrase original sin in one of his sermons, which was like, what was he thinking? And when he died, he was mourned throughout New York City, not just by the Jewish community, but by the non-Jewish community too. And Columbia actually commissioned a medal with his likeness on it, which still exists in the archives. So he was quite an interesting example of this Jewish leader who was very influenced by Christianity, dressed like a Christian, gave himself a title like a Christian, but also was profoundly, a Jewish guy and led davening in Hebrew and etc. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to close with this. Jews from this period don't leave behind theoretical discussions about what it meant to be a distinctive Jewish community in a very welcoming American society. They don't talk about it. I don't think they were sophisticated enough to have that discussion. Not that they weren't sophisticated, but they weren't Jewishly sophisticated enough to have that discussion. They just were interested in being American, and so they just did it. That they didn't think about sort of the philosophy behind it. Certainly we see that they did not favor standing apart from American society. They wanted to really be part of and integrated with American society. This is an era where they're going to be petitioning the government to be full members of society, and we're going to see how that happens next week and sort of a little bit of the bumps that they encountered along the way, but very small bumps. They were really more worried about gaining in full admission to society than about maintaining the interior contours of the communities that they lived in. So I just put here a quote by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a founding father of the United States.
Was he a Jew?
He was not a Jew. He was a Christian, a deist, who signed the Declaration of Independence and who was at the Continental Congress. And he witnessed, remember I told you that story earlier about the when Pennsylvania adopted the Constitution, that the Mikveh Israel Chazan walked in the parade with the 2 Christian clergy members. So he writes about it afterwards, and he says, pains were taken to connect ministers of the most dissimilar religious principles together, to shew the influence of a free government in promoting Christian charity. The rabbi, he called him a rabbi, he didn't realize he wasn't, of the Jews, locked in arms of 2 ministers of the gospel, was a most delightful sight. So here we have the transition to what we're going to talk about next week, which is we have this community of Jews which is doing very nicely in terms of its relationship with the Gentiles, very nicely economically, is really struggling in terms of maintaining its Jewish distinctiveness, not really sure where it wants to go, not well educated enough to make good decisions, and not putting money into getting better educated. So they're really, they're on a trajectory for amazing integration, but perhaps not continuity. Next week, we're going to talk about how they gain rights in the society. And then in our final session, which will be after winter break, we'll talk about the struggle for continuity and the heartbreak that happens in certain homes because of that.
Future emigrations of Jews, large numbers, must have solidified the Jewish-
Absolutely, and they needed it because these people almost all ended up assimilating and intermarrying. Yeah, when the Germans came, they helped out a lot, and when Eastern Europeans came, that was a very big deal.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
You know what? The reason I was married in Jewry, Israel, is because I was teaching Sunday school there. And I just found out recently, I was 19 years old when I was teaching. And there was a little boy in the class, a skinny little boy. His name was James Kugel.
Wow.
And
Do you know who James Kugel is?
well, I didn't know until very recently. And one time we had a meeting.
You were James Kugel's Hebrew school teacher?
Sunday school.
Oh my.
And then, wait a minute, we once had a meeting in his home on Central Park West. I remember the rug, it must have been an antique or something that I remember. And then recently, I hear that he's this big professor, and the one who was at the head of the Hebrew school was Bat Pfeffer at the time, and she was still alive then. I said, is it our James Kugel? She said, yes.
He's a professor at Harvard of Bible.
Retired.
He's retired? Yeah. Yeah. So he was a professor, right? But
So I
he's
said, if I ever
one,
hear him
one of the most
talk-
brilliant scholars of Bible,
If I
alive.
ever hear him talk somewhere,
Radical
I'm gonna go
thinker.
up and say, I'm so proud of you.
Nachas. Yeah.
That's why I was married there.